There is someone in your life right now who drains you. You can feel it, that specific exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much sleep you got. It's not physical tiredness, it's something deeper. A kind of heaviness that settles in your chest after you've spent time with them, or even just after you've seen their name on your phone screen. You pause before answering. You rehearse conversations before they happen. You replay interactions afterward, trying to figure out what you did wrong. Why you feel so small, why the air around this person always seems to cost you something. Maybe it's someone you love. That's the worst kind, when the person depleting you is also the person you're trying to hold on to. Maybe it's someone at work, someone you can't simply walk away from. Someone who has woven themselves so deeply into the fabric of your daily life that removing them feels like surgery without anesthesia. And the most disorienting part? You can't always explain it. You try to describe this person to someone else and you sound unreasonable. They're charming in public. They have good days. They say the right things sometimes. So you doubt yourself. You wonder if the problem is you, your sensitivity, your perception, your inability to just let things go. The Stoics had a name for this confusion. They called it the fog that descends when we allow the external world to define our internal one. And 2,000 years before the modern concept of toxic relationships existed, the Stoics were already mapping the exact psychology of destructive people, and more importantly, they were developing the inner architecture needed to survive them. Marcus Aurelius, ruling the most powerful empire on earth, was surrounded by senators who wanted him dead, advisors who manipulated for personal gain, and people who smiled at him in the morning and conspired against him by afternoon. He didn't have the luxury of simply walking away, so he built something instead. Something internal, something no one could touch, what he built and what Epictetus and Seneca before him described in meticulous detail is exactly what you need right now. Because here's the question that this ancient philosophy forces you to sit with. What if the most dangerous thing about a toxic person isn't what they do to you, but what they slowly convince you to do to yourself? That question will unravel something by the time we're done here. But first, you need to learn how to see clearly, because you cannot protect what you cannot name. The first sign, they make you the author of their chaos. That's a particular kind of conversation that leaves you feeling guilty for something you didn't do. You entered it with a concern, a boundary, a simple observation, and somehow, by the end, you are apologizing. You are consoling them. You are the one who caused the wound, even though you were the one who arrived bleeding. This is not an accident. It is a pattern so consistent in certain kinds of people that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The Stoics would have recognized it immediately, because they spent enormous intellectual energy studying the relationship between reason and manipulation, between those who engage the world through logos, through rational discourse, and those who engage it through something far more corrosive. Epictetus was born a slave. Let that sit for a moment. He was owned. His body was not his own. His freedom of movement, of labor, of basic human dignity, all of it subject to the will of another person. His master, a man named Epictetus, reportedly once broke Epictetus's leg, some accounts say deliberately to demonstrate his power. And by one account, as his leg was being twisted, Epictetus said calmly, "You are going to break it." When it snapped, he said simply, "Did I not tell you?" What is that? What kind of mind produces that response? It is the mind that has made a complete and total distinction between what belongs to it and what does not. Epictetus's leg belonged to Epaphroditus in the brutal legal reality of ancient Rome, but Epictetus's response, his judgment, his inner state, that belonged to no one but himself. And no amount of physical cruelty could cross that threshold. Now think about the toxic person in your life. Think about the mechanism they use most reliably. It is almost always some version of this. They create a problem and then they install you as the cause of it. You said something wrong. You didn't say enough. You were too distant, too present, too emotional, too cold. The specific charge changes. The verdict is always the same. You are responsible for their pain. This is what the Stoics called a corruption of reason. Not evil in the dramatic, cartoonish sense. Something quieter and more insidious. A person who has, consciously or not, learned to survive by making others carry the weight of their inner disorder. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal, in notes he never intended for anyone, to read something that reads almost like a personal warning to himself, that when you wake each morning, you should expect to encounter the ungrateful, the violent, the treacherous, the envious, and the antisocial. He didn't write this to be cynical. He wrote it because naming a thing strips it of its power to surprise you. The moment you recognize the pattern loses half its grip. So here is what recognition looks like in practice. A toxic person who makes you the author of their chaos will do several specific things. They will never acknowledge a grievance without immediately converting it into a counter-grievance. They will respond to your pain with a recitation of their own, not in solidarity but in competition. They will use your vulnerabilities, the ones you shared in trust, as ammunition the moment they feel threatened. And crucially, they will do all of this while maintaining a posture of being the victim. The confusion this creates is not incidental. It is the mechanism itself. The Stoic response is not to argue harder. It is not to present more evidence of your case. Marcus understood this when dealing with political rivals who were, by any rational measure, in the wrong. Arguing with someone who has decided that reality is whatever serves them is not a philosophical debate, it is a trap. Every word you offer becomes material they can reshape. What the Stoics prescribed instead is something that feels almost counterintuitive in the moment: clarity without combat. See the behavior for what it is. Name it internally with precision, and refuse to accept the authorship they are trying to assign you, not with aggression, with the quiet, immovable certainty of someone who knows the difference between their own mind and someone else's chaos. Epictetus would say, they can break your leg. They cannot make you believe it was your fault. The question this raises, and it is one that will deepen as we go further, is what happens when you've already accepted the authorship? When years of this dynamic have made their version of reality feel like your own, that is where the real Stoic work begins. But before we get there, you need to recognize the second sign. Because toxic people rarely arrive with just one weapon. The second sign, they punish you for having boundaries imagined. Drawing a line in sand and then watching someone stare at you with cold contempt for having drawn it. Not crossing it, not yet. Just looking at you with that specific expression that communicates without words that your act of self-definition is a form of aggression toward them. That the very fact that you have an inner life with edges and limits is something they experience as a personal attack. This is the second sign. And it is one of the most reliable indicators that you are dealing with someone whose relationship to other people is fundamentally extractive. Seneca spent years in exile. The Emperor Claudius banished him to the island of Corsica on what most historians believe were fabricated charges, political maneuvering dressed up as justice. For 8 years, Seneca lived removed from everything he had built, his reputation, his social world, his wealth, his influence. Everything he had accumulated in Rome was, in an instant, made inaccessible to him. And yet the letters and essays Seneca wrote during and after this period are not letters of a broken man. They are among the most alive pieces of philosophical writing in human history. Because Seneca discovered something in exile that he might never have discovered in comfort. That every attachment he had believed necessary was actually optional. That his sense of self, his capacity for thought, for relationship, for meaning, none of it required the permission of Claudius or Rome or anyone. He wrote, "The wise man can lose nothing, because everything he truly has is within him." This is what a person with a healthy inner life looks like. They can be removed from everything external and still be themselves. And because they are rooted in themselves, they do not need to consume others. The toxic person is the inversion of this. They have no stable inner core, or what inner core exists is built entirely from external validation, from the compliance of those around them, from the feeling of being needed, feared, or central. This means that your boundary, your simple act of saying, "This is where I end and you begin," threatens the entire structure of how they experience reality. And so they punish it, not always overtly. Sometimes the punishment is a withdrawal of warmth that is so precise and calibrated that you find yourself scrambling to restore it. Sometimes it is a sudden vulnerability, tears, collapse, crisis that appears the moment you assert yourself, training you to associate your own needs with causing damage. Sometimes it is a slow poisoning of your reputation with others, a quiet campaign conducted in the background that you only discover when you notice people treating you differently. Epictetus described this pattern in terms of what he called the tyrant's essential weakness. The tyrant, he said, cannot actually harm you, not in the ways that matter. They can imprison your body, they cannot imprison your will, but the tyrant's survival depends on you not knowing this. The moment you fully understand the limits of their power collapses. So they spend enormous energy ensuring you never arrive at that understanding. Every punishment for your boundary is, at its root, an attempt to prevent you from discovering how little they can actually take from you. Think about the dynamics this creates over time. If you have spent years with someone who punishes boundary setting, you have likely undergone a slow erosion. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the gradual narrowing of the territory you feel entitled to claim as your own. You stop wanting certain things because wanting them creates conflict. You stop expressing certain feelings because those feelings invite retaliation. You learn to make yourself smaller, and eventually the smallness stops feeling like a choice. It feels like who you are. This is what Marcus Aurelius was writing against when he reminded himself, repeatedly, that no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. He phrased it differently. In the language of Stoic philosophy, he spoke of the ruling faculty, the hegemonikon, the part of you that cannot be touched unless you surrender it. But the insight is identical. The moment you accept someone else's judgment of your worth as true, you have handed them the only power they were ever seeking. The Stoic practice here is not armor. It is clarity. It is learning again and again to distinguish between the discomfort of holding a boundary and the pain of having been genuinely wrong. These feel identical in the moment because toxic people work very hard to make them feel identical, but they are not. Discomfort in the presence of someone's displeasure is not evidence that you have done wrong. It is often evidence that you have done right. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius, described the moment of genuine freedom as the moment. You stop needing the approval of those who were never capable of offering it honestly. He wasn't advocating coldness. He was describing something warmer than approval-seeking ever produces, the deep, settled peace of a person who knows their own worth without requiring it to be confirmed by the very person who denies it. The first two signs are about how these people interact with you. The next sign is about something more subtle, something that happens not in grand confrontations, but in the quiet accumulation of small moments. And it is, in many ways, the most dangerous of all. The third sign, they drain you without offering anything real there, is a kind of exhaustion that only certain relationships produce. Not the healthy tiredness of deep conversation, where you've given something real and received something real in return, where you leave depleted in the way a good run depletes you, with that underlying sense of having been used well. This is different. This is the exhaustion of having been extracted from, of having poured and received in return, something that looked like nourishment but left you hungrier than before. The Stoics spent considerable time thinking about what they called the quality of human connection, not in sentimental terms, but in the precise language of what a relationship actually produces in the souls of those involved. They divided the world with perhaps uncomfortable clarity into those who add to you and those who subtract from you. Not in terms of what they provide materially, not in terms of how much they entertain or distract you, but in terms of what happens to your inner life in their sustained presence. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire of 60 million people, surrounded by advisors and generals and senators at every waking moment, wrote privately about the specific quality of aloneness he sought. Not isolation, not misanthropy, but the kind of solitude that a man needs to return to himself to remember who he is beneath all the noise of what others want him to be. He had learned through long experience to identify those whose company genuinely restored him, who spoke truthfully, who engaged with real ideas, who were capable of saying, "I don't know," or "I was wrong." And he had learned equally to identify those whose company was a performance, who were present only in the sense that their bodies occupied the room, whose words, however polished, were always ultimately about securing something from them. Power, favor, validation, proximity. The draining person is rarely obvious about this. They don't announce their extractive nature. In fact, one of the defining characteristics is a surface warmth, an apparent intimacy that makes the extraction invisible for a long time. They share vulnerabilities, but only as currency. They offer affection, but conditionally, time to maintain your investment. They create the feeling of closeness without the substance of it. What you are actually experiencing in these relationships is a kind of ongoing emotional labor with no return on investment. You are doing the work of empathy, patience, interpretation, and forgiveness. They are doing the work of maintenance, keeping you engaged enough to continue doing that work on their behalf. Epictetus described the Stoic ideal of friendship in terms that initially sound cold but become profound on reflection. A true friend, he said, is someone whose virtue you can trust, someone whose character, when tested, reveals integrity. Everything else is pleasant company at best and dangerous dependency at worst. Because a relationship built on anything less than character is a relationship built on conditions, and conditions can be revoked the moment your utility diminishes. Think about the person who drains you. Think about what the relationship actually requires of you. Think about the vigilance, the constant calibration of your words and responses to manage their reactions. The ongoing emotional surveillance, making sure the atmosphere is right, making sure nothing you say or do triggers the withdrawal of warmth or the onset of one of their crises. This is not relationship. This is management. And you have been doing it so long it may no longer feel like work. It may feel like love. Seneca wrote something in his letters that has the quality of a cold shower. We must be careful about the friends we choose, because we inevitably become like them, not through intention, not through conscious mimicry, but through the slow gravitational pull of what we spend our time tolerating, adapting to, and absorbing. If you spend years in proximity to someone whose primary mode is manipulation, whose relationship to truth is instrumental, whose capacity for genuine accountability is absent, you do not emerge unchanged. You either erect defenses that begin to distort your ability to trust anyone, or you gradually internalize their framing. You begin to see the world through a lens ground by someone with a distorted vision. The Stoics were not advising harshness here. Marcus Aurelius wrote with genuine compassion about even the most difficult people in his life, understanding that those who cause harm are almost always suffering their own form of inner disorder. But compassion, Stoic philosophy insists, does not require proximity. You can wish someone well from a distance. You can understand someone's wound without letting them wound you. There is a practice the Stoics called the premeditation of hardship. Premeditatio malorum, imagining the difficulties that may come in order to prepare for them without panic. Apply this here. Imagine a version of your life in which this draining relationship slowly, quietly steals another 5 years, another decade. Imagine the version of you that emerges from that sustained extraction. Then ask yourself what that version of you would give to have made a different choice now. While the choice is still available, the question this opens, and it is the one that cuts deepest, is whether the discomfort of leaving or limiting something draining is greater than the damage of staying. The Stoics had a clear answer, but we need to look at 2 more signs before we can understand why. The 4th sign, they cannot tolerate your growth. Something very specific happens when you begin to change for the better in the presence of a person who is not good for you. They become uncomfortable. Not visibly, not always. Sometimes it's subtle, a slight edge in the voice when you mention a new habit, a dismissiveness toward an accomplishment that they cannot diminish entirely, so they diminish partially. a way of returning every conversation about your progress back to your deficiencies. Sometimes it's more direct, mockery dressed as honesty, concern about whether you're changing too much, quiet campaigns to recruit others into skepticism about who you're becoming. This sign is perhaps the most revealing of all, because it exposes the underlying architecture of what the toxic person actually needs from you. And what they need is not your happiness. What they need is your stasis, your continued residence at the level where they found you. Marcus Aurelius understood this in the context of his political life with a precision that reads, centuries later, as almost clinical. He wrote, without self-pity, about those who were threatened by competence, not openly, not heroically, but through the small and steady erosions of reputation, the whispered doubts, the strategic minimizations. He was emperor. They could not remove him. So they worked on his story, his legacy, his sense of himself, he wrote. In his private journal, a reminder to himself, it is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. It is not a weakness. It is called life. But then he pressed deeper into the question that mattered. Can the opinion of another person actually diminish you? Can their mockery reduce your virtue? Can their contempt subtract from the quality of your character? His answer, arrived at not through optimism but through rigorous Stoic analysis, was no. They cannot. Not because opinion doesn't sting, it does, he was honest about this, but because the sting is in you, not in them. And the thing they are attacking, your reputation, your image, your standing in others' eyes, is not the thing that matters most. The thing that matters most is what you are actually doing, actually becoming, in the quiet work of your daily life. Epictetus had a student ask him once what to do when people mocked his philosophical studies. When friends and family treated his pursuit of wisdom as pretension, as eccentricity, as something to be gently but firmly discouraged, his answer was characteristic: let them. Your philosophy is not diminished by their mockery. It is only proven necessary. But here is the subtler truth that the Stoics were approaching from a different angle. A person who cannot celebrate your growth, who is threatened by your becoming more wiser, more grounded, more free, is telling you something crucial about what they want from the relationship. They want a version of you that needs them. And growth, genuine growth, always moves in the direction of needing people less and choosing them more. Think about the distinction. You need someone when their absence creates a crisis, when you have no inner resources that don't run through them, when your sense of self is organized around their presence. You choose someone when you are whole without them, and you choose to share that wholeness with them because what they add to your life is real, not necessary in the consuming sense, but genuinely enriching. The toxic person has a deep and often unconscious terror of being chosen rather than needed. Because being chosen requires them to be worth choosing, and this demands a confrontation with who they actually are, which is something they are not willing to undertake. It is far simpler, far less threatening. To ensure that you never become free enough to choose freely, Seneca wrote about this dynamic in his essay on the shortness of life, one of the most urgent pieces of philosophical writing ever produced. He observed that most people do not truly live. They exist in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for the conditions to be right before they begin the life they imagine themselves living. They postpone courage, postpone honesty, postpone growth, and they surround themselves, often unconsciously, with people who reinforce this postponement. Because to witness someone else's genuine growth is to be confronted with the reality of your own stagnation, the toxic. Person who cannot tolerate your growth is not simply jealous in the ordinary sense. They are defending a worldview in which change is not possible, in which people are fixed in their nature and their limitations, in which the attempt to become better is naive at best and threatening at worst. Your growth disproves this worldview, and the disproving of it is the most existential threat you can pose to them. The Stoic response is not to hide your growth. It is not to minimize your progress to manage their comfort. It is, instead, to understand that how someone responds to your becoming more fully yourself is one of the most reliable measures of what they actually want from you. And to choose with open eyes whether what they want is something you are willing to provide, there is one more sign. And it is the one that, once understood, changes everything. Because the first four signs are about what the toxic person does. The fifth sign is about what they produce in you. And it is both the most dangerous and, in the Stoic tradition, the most transformable. The fifth sign. You have started to become someone you don't recognize. This is the sign that arrives last. And it arrives quietly. It doesn't announce itself as a crisis. There's no dramatic moment where you look in the mirror and see a stranger. It's subtler than that, a slow, almost imperceptible drift from the person you were, the person you intended to be, towards something smaller. More defended, more reactive, less alive. You notice it first in small things. You are quicker to anger than you used to be, or you have become oddly flat. The things that once moved you no longer seem to reach you. You find yourself saying things you don't mean in order to keep the peace. You find yourself doubting perceptions that a year ago you would have trusted without question. You have developed certain reflexes, a hair-trigger defensiveness, a habitual guilt, a preemptive self-diminishment that runs so automatically you barely notice you're doing it. This is what sustained exposure to a toxic presence produces in a healthy person. Not immediate damage. Gradual recalibration. The psyche is adaptive. It is one of our greatest strengths. But in a toxic environment, this adaptability becomes its own form of harm. You adapt to dysfunction. You become functional within an environment that is not functional. And over time, the adaptations become so deeply embedded that you can no longer distinguish them from your actual character. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this with the specific urgency of a man who understood that ruling. The most powerful empire in the world made him uniquely vulnerable to corruption, not the dramatic corruption of greed or cruelty, but the quiet corruption of simply becoming imperceptibly less than he intended to be. He wrote to himself, "Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect." It was a warning he had to issue to himself repeatedly, not because he was weak, but because the pressure to compromise was constant, sophisticated, and often dressed in the language of necessity or pragmatism. The people around him were often genuinely trying to convince him that the version of Marcus who kept his integrity was naive, impractical, not suited to the real demands of power. And each small compromise they solicited was, in isolation, defensible. It was only in aggregate that the drift would have become catastrophic. This is exactly what the toxic person in your life has been doing. Each individual moment of their influence is defensible. Each single instance of your adaptation is explainable. But the aggregate, the cumulative drift over months and years is a person who has moved, without clear decision, away from their own center. Epictetus called this the greatest danger that any person faces. Not poverty, not illness, not even death, but the slow theft of your own soul, conducted so gradually and subtly that you participate in it without awareness. He said that a person who loses money has lost nothing that matters. A person who loses reputation has lost something that was always at the mercy of others. But a person who loses themselves, who abandons their own judgment, their own values, their own capacity for honest self-assessment, has lost the only thing that was ever truly theirs. The Stoic framework for recovering yourself from this condition is not a list of tactics. It is a reorientation, a fundamental shift in where you locate your sense of identity and worth. And it begins with one practice that the Stoics considered foundational above all others: the evening examination. Every night, Seneca wrote, the wise person sits in quiet review of the day, not to condemn themselves, not to perform an audit of failures, but to ask with genuine curiosity, who was I today? Where did I act from my own values, and where did I act from fear? Where did I speak my truth, and where did I manage someone else's reaction at the expense of my own integrity? Where did I recognize myself, and where did I drift? This is not a comfortable practice. But comfort, the Stoics insisted repeatedly, is not the goal. The goal is clarity. And clarity, pursued honestly and consistently, has a remarkable effect on drift. It makes it visible. And what is visible can be corrected. Begin tonight. Sit with the question, in the presence of this person, who am I becoming? Not who I used to be, not who I want to be, but who I am actually measurably, demonstrably becoming under their sustained influence. The answer to this question is not a verdict on them. It is information for you. The most important information available. The Inner Citadel. Building the fortress they cannot enter. Everything we have covered so far has been about recognition. The 5 signs, the mechanisms, the patterns, but recognition without transformation is just a more sophisticated form of suffering. You see the trap clearly and you are still in it. The Stoics were not in the business of producing people who could identify their problems with precision while remaining helplessly inside them. They were in the business of producing people who could not be broken. And the architectural metaphor they returned to again and again was the citadel. Marcus Aurelius wrote of the inner citadel, the fortress of the mind, that remains impregnable when everything external has been stripped away. This is not a metaphor for emotional suppression. It is a metaphor for a particular kind of inner structure, something built deliberately, maintained consciously. That gives you a place to retreat to that is genuinely yours. The citadel is not built through avoidance. It is not built by finding the right circumstances, the right people, the right environment in which nothing difficult can reach you. It is built in the presence of difficulty, in the practice of responding rather than reacting, in the daily discipline of returning to your own values even when the pressure to abandon them is intense. Seneca described this process in terms of what he called the work of self-possession. To possess yourself means to be the one primarily responsible for your inner state, not as a denial that other people affect you, but as an insistence that how they affect you is not entirely beyond your influence. Between stimulus and response, Epictetus taught there is a space. That space is where your freedom lives. It is small at first, almost imperceptible, especially after years of reactive conditioning, but it grows with practice. And as it grows, the toxic person's power over your inner state diminishes proportionally. This is the fundamental Stoic insight about toxic relationships. The question is never only, how do I get away from this person? It is always also, how do I become someone this person cannot reach? Because if you leave without doing the inner work, you will find another version of the same dynamic. The specific individuals will change. The pattern will not. It cannot, because the pattern is not primarily about them. It is about the aspects of your own psychology that made you available to be shaped by them. Marcus Aurelius. When he encountered the most difficult people in his life, the senators who conspired against him, the advisors who lied to him, the military commanders who betrayed their oath, did not respond with matching darkness. He wrote about this explicitly. When you encounter someone acting badly, ask yourself what virtue they are lacking that allows this behavior. Not to excuse them, to understand them, and to recognize that the same deficit could exist in you, in different form, if you did not maintain the inner work, someone who can be in the presence of manipulation without being manipulated, someone who can witness cruelty without responding with either cruelty or collapse, someone who can hold a boundary with the quiet certainty of a person who has done the work of knowing what they stand for. The building of this citadel has specific practices. The morning reflection, asking, before the day begins, what challenges you might face and how you choose to respond. The evening examination, honest review of where you held your ground and where you drifted. The practice of amor fati, of looking at even the most painful circumstances of your life, including the presence of this difficult person, and asking what they are asking you to become, not what they are doing to you. What they are calling forth in you, what strength, what clarity, what commitment to yourself that might not have been forged in easier circumstances. This is not the toxic person's gift to you. They owe you nothing and you owe them nothing, but their presence in your life, engaged with Stoic philosophy, can become the exact pressure that produces the diamond they could never have intended. The convergence, what all 5 signs are actually telling you. Began this knowing something was wrong, but not being able to fully name it. That naming matters not because a named wound heals automatically, but because a named thing can be responded to rather than simply suffered. The 5 signs we have walked through are not random. They form a coherent picture. Someone who makes you the author of their chaos, who punishes you for having a self, who drains you without real return, who cannot tolerate your growth, and who has slowly reshaped you into someone you don't fully recognize. This person is not simply difficult. They are, in the Stoic framework, someone whose relationship to their own inner disorder makes them genuinely dangerous to your inner freedom. Not because of who they are, but because of what sustained, unexamined exposure to them does to who you are becoming. Marcus Aurelius made peace with this kind of person by understanding them as he would understand the nature of fire. Fire burns. It is not malicious. It is simply its nature. You do not argue with fire about whether it should burn. You do not blame yourself for having been burned. You simply learn, clearly and permanently, to manage your proximity to it. This is not coldness. Seneca wrote to Lucilius that the truly wise person is capable of tremendous warmth, but that their warmth is not a debt they owe to anyone who demands it. It is a quality of their character that they share where it is genuinely received and genuinely merited. Warmth poured into the hands of someone who will weaponize it is not love. It is a sacrifice of yourself to someone else's dysfunction. The question the Stoics ultimately ask about every relationship, every connection, every investment of your finite time and irreplaceable attention does this relationship move you toward virtue or away from it? Does the person in question help you become more of who you intend to be or less? Not more comfortable, not more validated, not more entertained, but more genuinely alive, more grounded in your own values, more fully yourself. This is the test. And it is not a test anyone, but you can administer the transformation. What changes when you finally see clearly there is a specific moment, and if you have stayed with this long enough, you may have already felt its early tremors when philosophy stops being information and becomes orientation. When it stops being something you understand intellectually and becomes something that reorganizes how you move through the world. The Stoics called this moment the turning of the soul. Not a dramatic conversion, not a crisis followed by revelation. More like a compass settling to north after years of being held near something magnetic that distorted it. The distortion is removed. The needle finds its true direction. And everything that follows is navigation from that truer point. What changes when you can see a toxic person with full Stoic clarity? First, their behavior stops being a mystery. The exhausting interpretive labor, the endless wondering about what they meant. What you did, what would appease them, ceases because you are no longer trying to solve a puzzle whose solution is you changing yourself to accommodate their dysfunction. You see the pattern as a pattern, static, consistent, not personal. Second, your responses change. Not because you become cold, but because you become deliberate. Where before you reacted with guilt, with defensiveness, with the reflexive people-pleasing that had become automatic, now there is that space Epictetus described. Small at first, but real. Third, you stop making their approval the measure of your worth. This is perhaps the most disorienting shift, because much of what had felt like care in the relationship was actually your sustained attempt to earn a positive verdict from someone who had decided, consciously or not, never to give one. When you stop auditioning for an audience that has already made up its mind, the energy you recover is extraordinary, Seneca wrote near the end of his life, about the particular freedom that comes from releasing the need to be understood by everyone. Some people, he said, we can genuinely reach, and with those people, truth is possible. Real exchange, mutual growth, the rare and precious experience of being genuinely known. But other people have closed the door from the inside, and no amount of effort on your part can open it. The Stoic wisdom is to stop knocking. This does not mean you hate them. It does not mean you become indifferent to their humanity. It means you accept, with clear eyes and genuine compassion, that their growth, like all growth, is their responsibility, and that your responsibility is to yourself, to the inner citadel, to the version of you that exists beneath all the adaptation, all the accommodation, all the slow drift away from your own center. That version of you is still there, waiting, the Stoics would say. It has never left. It cannot leave because it is not something external that can be taken. It is the deepest nature of your mind, your reason, your capacity for virtue. The toxic person may have buried it under years of their influence. But buried things can be unearthed, the beginning disguised as an ending if you have recognized yourself. In any of this, if some part of what we've explored has landed, with the specific weight of truth rather than the lighter weight of interesting information, then something has already shifted. Recognition is not nothing. It is, in the Stoic tradition, the first and most necessary act of a person. Beginning to reclaim their inner life, what comes next is not easy. The Stoics never promised ease. What they promised was something far more valuable, that the difficulty you face in choosing yourself, in holding your boundaries, in building the inner citadel, this difficulty is purposeful. It is the work. And the work, done honestly, does not produce a person who never suffers. It produces a person who cannot be defined by their suffering. Marcus Aurelius, on his deathbed, is reported to have asked those around him why they wept for him. He said, "Weep for the pestilence of the empire, the lies, the corruption. Not for me." He had done the work of a lifetime. He had faced every difficult person, every betrayal, every weight of power and expectation and human cruelty, and he had remained at his core himself. That is not a small achievement. In a world that works unceasingly to make you someone else, remaining genuinely yourself is the most radical act available to you. Begin the evening examination tonight. Sit quietly. Ask honestly, who have I been today? Where have I held my ground and where have I drifted? What did my response to this difficult person reveal about the work I still need to do? Do not answer with judgment. Answer with curiosity. The Stoics were, above all, students of themselves, and the classroom never closes. You know the 5 signs now. You know what to look for, and you know what seeing clearly requires of you. The question you carry forward, the one the Stoics would want you to sit with, is not, how do I make them different? It is this, knowing what I now know, who do I choose to become? That question has no easy answer. But it is the only question that has ever led anywhere worth going.